Hello, Tara and Yousuf. Thank you for joining me today to talk about vehicle stop data. This is a discussion in preparation for our annual general meeting on July 19th, where we'll have a brief discussion about policing. But one of the issues that we've been following alongside of wanting to have the city adopt community policing as a philosophy and a strategy for engaging the public is looking at some of the desperate outcomes as a result of the current policing that we do. And we believe it's the reason that the vehicle stops are desperate is because there is such a high focus on investigative stops that are not productive. So Black drivers are stopped overwhelmingly more than white drivers. We also believe this can be implicit bias, but most of the response that we get back from the city is that it's not race-oriented. Race has nothing to do with it. We actually have a professor at University of Missouri, Jeffrey Milo, who's written a report that discounts that race has anything to do with it and invokes this veil of darkness excuse for the disparities. So we will talk about that report and we'll talk about the data. So we'll start with a data set from 2017. And Tara Warne-Griggs will talk about that. She's been Race Matters Friends, big data geek on the policing data. And then we have a young partner here. Yousuf, tell me how to say your last name so I don't mess it up.
El-Jayyousi.
El-Jayyousi. Yousuf El-Jayyousi. Okay.
Yousuf El-Jayyousi.
Okay, so he is going to bring his giant young brain to help us folks out to look at a newer dose of data, if you will, and give us some feedback with his charts and graphs. But I thought we would start with Tara giving us sort of an overview of what her contextualization of 2017 data says to us about investigative stops. So I thought we'd start there. And I'm going to scroll back up to the beginning, Tara, and let you tell me when to move and go on the slides.
Sure.
All right.
I'll seek apologies first off for my drawing skills, but
awesome.
I'm a firm believer in mapping out processes and looking at what the different data is at each of those steps.
Right.
One of the issues that has come up in the literature on vehicle stops is the amount of discretion that officers have, not only to make a stop, but then of course dictating what events occur after the stop. So that's what that first slide is. So you can go ahead and advance, Trace. So we have a summary here. So since the year 2000, the disparity index for Black drivers has consistently been over 2.0. And 2019, we have the highest disparity index over the last, I think, 20 years, Tracy? I can't remember for sure.
Since 2000 when it started.
Since 2000. So there's been no movement, right, in the trend of disparities. If anything, the trend is up over time. And those disparities exist even when we substitute a different denominator and use the American Community Survey to replace the 2010 census data for subsequent years, past 2014. So it counts for population changes. Those disparities don't go away. The Milo paper does show at least some level of officer level bias, and this is an important distinction, officer level bias for 2016, but not in 2017. And we'll talk about this later when Yousuf talks about his analysis of the Milo report. So one of the issues that I think we have had with that paper is that there's a statistical analysis of 2 years worth of data along alongside a trend of 18 years of disparities.
Yeah.
And so it's not a complete picture.
I think
and then we also have, and I'm also a big believer in triangulating data. So we have quantitative data that shows, yes, there are disparities, but we also have feedback from our community from 8 listening tour sessions related specifically to vehicle stops that indicate widespread racial disparities in policing, particularly around driving. So you need all of those, you need the quantitative piece and you need the qualitative piece to give you a complete picture. of the experience of being a Black driver in Colombia.
I think that business of picking just 2016 and 2017 is cherry picking, right? And doesn't allow you to see things more deeply. Okay.
So the big things that I wanted to look at, because we know from public statements that that our Columbia Police Department has made, that they rely on vehicle stops as an investigative tool. They don't actually do a lot of just traffic policing for traffic violations. They use those stops to look for contraband, look for people that they are looking for in connection to other crimes. And so our question is, do we get a lot out of that effort that would offset the impact on drivers, specifically the overall Black community, our lack of public, the public trust in the police department, trust with the city, and it creates and continues to create this us versus them mentality, that the police are there to control a specific population in Colombia. And so what is the cost benefit of disproportionate minority contact resulting in racial disparities in stops? So that's kind of the question. In the literature, there are basically two perspectives on the reason for disparities. Lori Friedel, who does a lot of work around implicit bias, says that there may be, the few bad apples theory, that there are a few overt racists, but by and large, disparities in stops are based on the implicit bias on the part of officers. So it locates the cause in an individual behavior of officers, right? So it keeps this idea that racism is an individual person's problem. And then we have Charles Epp and I can't remember his first name. I want to say John Baumgartner.
Yeah, Baumgartner.
Have done a lot of work, and their conclusion is quite different, is that the disparities reflect institutional practice, emphasizing the use of investigative stops as a policing tool rather than as traffic enforcement. Yeah, just go ahead and populate the whole page. So I created these funnels to kind of look at, compare stops of African-American drivers versus white drivers. I think if you click on the,
is there a link on the bottom that I should, oh, here we go.
No, it's animated, I'm really sorry. There it goes, just keep clicking on it and it'll show up. So in 2017,
sorry.
That's okay. There were, just over 11,000 stops total. African Americans were 35% of those stops. White drivers accounted for 65%. The number of citations that were given, so actually just looked at the main part of the funnel. So out of 4,000 stops, over 3,000 of those, so almost 80%, were stopped with absolutely no consequence. They were let go with no citation and no arrest. And so that begs the question of, why was the stop made in the first place? And of those, they searched 266 of those drivers who were also let go with no citation and no arrest. The reason for searches was given drug odor. That's the number one. 89 of those were consent searches where they asked the driver, who they ended up letting go. I want to keep this thread going. They ended up letting go with no citation or arrest, consent to search their car. So they didn't have probable or reasonable suspicion that there was something. They just asked somebody that they pulled over on pretext if they could search the car. They were looking for a weapon, contraband. The drug dog gave them some kind of an indication that they should search the car. There was some kind of other incident, which is not defined in the data, and then an ambiguous other. And note that Colombia's African-American population is around 10%. I think if you look at the American Community Survey, it's up around 11 or 12 now. So it's not a huge, there hasn't been a huge shift in demographics. So what do we get for that? In terms, so we have down here the number of, over 3,000 drivers who were let go with no citation and no arrest, and a total of 165 instances of contraband, 23 weapons. And so the narrative we hear from the police department and the city when they talk about using vehicle stops as a tool to fight crime is that out of 4,000 people being stopped, we found 23 weapons. And the question we have to answer is, given the cost of those stops on the Black community, do we get enough crime reduction or enforcement for, and I think you would say, I would say no, right? And I think Race Matters Friends would say, that's an awful lot of impact on people who did nothing wrong, other than maybe have a taillight out or maybe made a turn from the wrong lane, to either be searched and interrogated about where they're going in order to get not a lot of impact in terms of public safety.
Right, and I think it's important to say that the cost is building mistrust and fear and about a lot of other negatives, right, that make people of color feel surveilled for no reasonable reason, right? And so that is the cost. How much mistrust is the department, willing to, give as a, for making all those stops. Mm-hmm. And here we have a little bit about historical context, and we'll leave this online for people that want to come back and look at some of the background historical context that we kept with this. There's a lot of argument about this equality versus
I don't like that slide anymore.
Equity slide, but I think it's important to say that equity is about meeting people where they're at and everyone having the same thing. It's not meaningful. Like, we all have access to education, we say in this country, but we don't all have same access to the same quality of education, right? So, but again, these will stay online for our viewers to come back and look at. This goes to my point earlier about cost, the community impact. It maintains a deep historical distrust of law enforcement, little incentive to cooperate with police. We've had a lot of crime lately, and so people mistrust the police. How much are they going to share information, right? And then just the snowballing effect of creating social marginalization for being stopped for what we would call petty mechanical issues and things like that, and fines that many people are stopped are poor. And this affects their job and their transportation, humiliation and stress, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm gonna stop with those and ask Yousuf, do you have any comments about those slides before you move into your data slides? Just a little commentary.
I mean, I think in general, I'm gonna go into a lot of that stuff, or
okay,
for the most part, it's gonna address similar things.
Okay, let's see what you got.
All right. So starting off with just a general arrest. So this is based on the Missouri State Highway Patrol and their general arrests in Boone County. And you can see that Black residents are far more likely to get arrested in Columbia. And then same thing with the traffic stops. This is pertaining to specifically Columbia Police Department though. I believe the number is about 3.4% or 3.4 times. So Black people are 3.4 times as likely to get pulled over as white residents. And then that's just like the face of it. If we go in deeper to it, with these searches, they are significantly more likely to get searched. So if we just start with how likely they are to be pulled over, Black people make up about 35% of those pulled over, but they make about 50% of those who are searched.
Wow.
So we see like this higher suspicion of Black people by the police department. And even more going in deeper, Black people are even more, they're less likely to give consent to that search. Wow. So police are finding probable cause more for Black people because, as we know by the Fourth Amendment, you can't be searched without probable cause. Let's see. For me, this graph is probably the strongest statistic and this is just arrest. It has nothing to do with vehicle stops. It's arrest for possession of marijuana. And you see Black people are almost 4 times as likely to be arrested for the possession of marijuana. And the reason this one is so strong is because we have other facts to back this up, because we know for a fact that Black people do not smoke more weed than white people. And we can see this. Can you guys see my screen right now?
Yes, we can.
Do you see a big chart?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So this is by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, a drug report that they release every single year, or every 2 years, something like that. So marijuana use in the past month, with a breakdown by race, in adults, it's 12% to 10%. So there's barely a difference there. There's no disparity. Yet in our traffic stop or in our arrest for marijuana, there's this huge disparity. That just like blatantly shows over-policing and racial bias in our police department. This is just showing it over time, the general disparity factor of vehicle stops. So this is like how underrepresented each community is within vehicle stops. So if the number is over 1, that would mean that they are overrepresented. If it is under 1, they're underrepresented in the population. So as you can see in the Black disparity factor, since 2014, we have seen it increase steadily every single year. I believe it was about a 25% increase since 2014. Wow. Meanwhile, the white disparity factor is just going down.
With one weird outlier.
My last graph, I actually, if you guys are ready to go into Milio's paper, it kind of to that.
Well, can you do the weapons one real fast though, just so we can?
It pertains to the paper, so I'm gonna bring it up.
Good. You'll come back
to that.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna like pull up my commentary on this.
Nice. I love this.
I haven't gone through every single little detail, but in general.
Okay. This is great.
So here he talks about that CPD is very efficient in their vehicle stops based off of their high arrest rates, outstanding warrants, and contraband. But that really shows nothing about efficiency. All it shows is criminalization.
Right.
So it's kind of just an irrelevant point to make.
Right.
Moving on. So it says Black drivers who are stopped are also more likely to have outstanding warrants and contraband, which is literally just false. It is based on a false statistic, and I'll go into that more in a second.
Wow.
So the fact that his veil of darkness method indicates that there is no racial profiling is also the methods he used makes it incredibly inaccurate. Okay, so now going into more of the details. So he says here that the disparity index that has been used in the past is inaccurate because most of it uses the 2010 demographic data, and so that means that it is overstated, which is actually untrue. If you use the most recent 2014 to 2018 ACSC estimate or ACS estimate, you still get these graphs.
That's American Community Survey for people who want to follow the jargon there.
But literally these graphs right here are using that, and you can still see the increase. So that statement has no grounds that it is overstated. Let's see. So then he says that it's kind of justified that there's that disparity because there is a disparity in the outstanding warrants between races. But to me, that only shows how deep this disparity goes and how deep the racial profiling goes. And then, so he says that the population of Black drivers who are searched are very different from the white drivers, and they're more likely to have contraband. And that's where I'm going to bring up this graph, because what he does in these graphs is he uses a disparity index, which he criticizes in the first place, but he says that they are more likely to have contraband. But he is basing this disparity index goes back to their population in Colombia rather than the population that are searched. So he is not taking into account sampling bias at all. So right here is like the percent searched. So you see that white people and Black people both make up 50% searched. So Black people are already getting searched way more than their actual population. But let's just look at assuming that they both make up 50%. Then we look at the reason they were searched, and Black people are far more likely to be suspected of having a weapon. But then we go back to whether a weapon was actually found, and they're still on par with the 50% search. So that means they're equally as likely to have a weapon. So the way he measured it is just inaccurate at all. Like, there's no evidence to point to the fact that they have more contraband.
Yeah, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
I think it's, I think that's a deliberate choice on his part, right? I mean, he knows statistics. And so he knows that he's creating a misleading, kind of self-serving data point there. So he's manipulating the way he uses it to drive home his point.
Yeah, for sure.
And his point is?
we'll get to that. He says it very clearly.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, so this is a thing that I just went over, but here's his point that he's making. He says, if anything, the CPD may be under-searching Black drivers. So he is literally calling for racial profiling of Black drivers. I mean, that is a definition of racial profiling, even though he goes on to say that racial profiling doesn't exist in the police department, but the statement says it should exist, basically. Let's see.
So I want to jump in again too. I think that also falls into the category of overtly racist, right?
Yeah.
In writing.
Yeah. In writing. I mean, he tells on himself there completely. Yes.
Okay. The main other thing that I want to talk about within this paper is the veil of darkness method. So what the veil of darkness method is suggesting that you can find a natural control in this experiment, which is nighttime. So supposedly at nighttime, officers cannot see the driver and their race, so therefore that acts as a control over whether they are actually biased or not. What he does not take into account is that we live in the 21st century and we have street lighting, and also not to mention all the other problems with geographic location, the trends in like policing at night versus during the day, the demographic of who is driving in the night during the day. And he even mentions it in this paragraph, but still does not account for any of those things.
I love it.
What?
I love this. Of course, there are some important caveats to keep in mind when interpreting the veil of darkness test for racial profiling. First, some street locations are well lit at night, so the strength of the natural experiment varies with geographic location within a city. Second, it's possible that Black drivers choose to drive more carefully, e.g. by obeying the speed limit, which I think is a dig, in the daytime, precisely because they are at potentially higher risk to being stopped during the day. That's also admission right there, right? This idea, you know, both of these phenomena may cause simple veil of darkness test to understate the extent of racial profiling. Understate the extent of racial profiling.
He even acknowledges it.
Yes, yes.
Well, and I think that dig is important, right? Again, it's similar to the survey, the thought exercise thing that the Columbia Public School sent out this week too, right? I mean, he's inviting and kind of planting the seed of Black people being dangerous, inherently more criminal, through what seems like kind of an innocent statement, right? It almost seems like he's admitting a little bit of fallibility there, but what he's really trying to do is to reinforce this idea that Black people are more likely to drive in ways that are against the law, that they're more likely to commit crime and therefore are inherently a threat to public safety, right? I mean, narratively, that's how that sentence seems to function to me.
Well, it functions to me as if saying that Black people are not compliant, and when it's dark, they drive one way, and then during the day they drive another way. But it's an implicit to me that the goal is that unless Black people are surveilled or know they're being surveilled, you know, they adjust their behavior accordingly if they think that they're being watched. So I don't know, it's kind of got a slave patrol kind of ring to it.
Yes, I agree completely.
Okay, what else you got, Yousuf?
So, I mean, he says the problem of ambient light at night can be addressed by incorporating controls over the location of the stops. But whenever you go through his methods and analysis, he never does that. He also says that he backs up his reasoning for using this method by saying that all of these cities have used this method before. But what he fails to say is that a lot of these cities used far more comprehensive methods to actually evaluate it. And some of them did find that there was actual racial profiling whenever you accounted for other things. So if we go to, let's see where I have it. So this is an MIT study conducted on Syracuse, which he mentioned, in which they decided to account for just lighting, because lighting is one of the biggest things. I mean, the entire control is based on lighting. And so the basis of this is what they did is that they counted for each stop and how much lighting there was in that area. And so what they found, let's see if I can find it.
Can I read this last part? Yousuf, would that be helpful for conclusion?
Oh, hold on. Wait, that's basically what I'm gonna get to.
Oh, there you are.
So what he says is that, what they say is that their analysis of Syracuse stops between 2006 and 2009, where ignoring streetlights often leads to conclusions of no racial profiling. So whenever you don't control for lighting, it'll appear as though there is no racial profiling. Okay. But whenever they used their test, which did account for lighting, they came to conclusions of racial profiling of Black people. And they actually found that Black drivers were 15% more likely to be stopped during daytime. So that's a pretty significant increase between nighttime and daytime.
Wow.
So using even Milio's method, you find racial profiling if you use his method correctly.
Wow. I like that last sentence of that conclusion. Can you go back to that? One thing I love about conclusions and discussions is the suggestions for what to think about, going further, etc. And it said, for future work, it may be useful to perform an outcome-based test on these data and compare the results to those of the veil test. Also, our refined measure of darkness is continuous, but we treat it as binary. Developing a test based on a continuous definition of darkness may also prove useful. So it's interesting. You can take these papers and they give advice and give suggestions about how to make our data analysis better and more fine-tuned. And, you know, and this person, obviously this paper was peer-reviewed and published, whereas Mr. Milio's paper was not. So I think that's an important thing to point out as well.
Yeah. Honestly, that's the main thing I have about
Okay.
it. The only other thing that I need to look into a little more is he talks about hit rate, which I think I haven't looked into it enough, but the way he's doing it seems to be very inaccurate because he says Black people have a higher hit rate for weapons. But again, he does not account for the sampling bias, which this does kind of account for. But yeah, he just comes up with so many different excuses for why Black people should be arrested or stopped more, which is just crazy to me.
So Tara, do you have any thoughts on that hit rate? I think we've talked about that before, have we not?
I need to go back and look at it over time again. But I want to say that hit rate kind of flips back and forth as to whether or not Black drivers are more likely or white drivers are more likely. And so I want to plot that as a trend. I haven't done that yet. And particularly whether it's for weapons and for overall contraband, I think having those on a chart next to each other would be illuminating.
Yes.
So I'll get to that. I think that if I'm remembering correctly, for at least one of the years that since we've been looking at the data since 2016, that wasn't the case. It may have been in 2017 or 2018, but I don't think it was for 2016, for example. So I think that, I don't think there's a big difference in hit rate, and so it kind of flips around.
Okay.
Anyway.
So Yousuf, one of the things I wanted to do, and I haven't had a chance to get to because I'm a doctoral student, and that is take those studies that have been done in the past couple, 2 or 3 years, and look at the discussions and the conclusions and the suggestions for future research, and sort of look at what does the past research say that we should be doing? What are the challenges that they had in their methodology? And also, what are their research questions? And so I'm not sure that there's a solid research question in this paper. Maybe I missed it. But is there, what is the research question that we're asking in Columbia? Is it, why is there a disparity, or what is producing the disparity? And I think that's an argument we continue to have. And oftentimes we get a response that says, well, we need to have more data, this isn't enough. So I would like for both of you, since you're data geeks, to say something about this thing that we need to have more data. And you said, when you answer, will you talk a little bit about how you got into this, what made you interested in it, and the tools that you use to do your analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, the first thing that made me want to look into it was with all the protests going on here in Colombia, and a lot of people were like, sort of praising CPD for not shooting the protesters with tear gas. I wanted to look into, like, are they actually good cops? Are they actually, because there is no such thing as a good cop.
For not shooting people.
So I had taken a class last summer that's an intro programming class for engineers, and you basically learn how to use the program called MATLAB, which is very useful for data manipulation. And
is it MAT or MAP?
MATLAB. So it's like Matrix Laboratory.
Oh, okay.
So I learned a lot of skills in that class on how to import very large files, because the Columbia Police Department posts their files just like raw data where nobody can actually visualize it,
right?
Because it's about 15,000 entries from 2019. So I was able to take those ginormous files and kind of go through them and create those graphs. But it's definitely something that you have to like have learned a very specific skill to do, and that's kind of frustrating that they don't have it in a way that's accessible to everyone to see. And obviously that's done on purpose, but it's very frustrating.
So do you think it also is that they don't have the skill set within their department that to analyze?
I mean, yeah, but I think
that way.
I think it's purposeful. They don't want to see this.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I agree completely.
I agree with you, but beyond the willful, I mean, as we're always looking at how we spend money relative to policing and we have these disparities, it seems that they are very good at making sure they don't have the intellectual capacity, right, to do the analysis and also the visualization. And I think your point about the visualization is really important, because there's all kinds of ways to read data. And I think putting things together visually in a way that helps people get a snapshot understanding is very good, is important. Not everybody can absorb like this article, go through it and critique it like the average public wouldn't know. So I think the graphs that you created, and even Tara's, hand-drawn illustrations, are very important to helping people break down big ideas about data and sort of chunk them. And so I think it's really cool that you took something from school that you learned about a new program and put it to public use. And what would it take to get our police department to value, right, that kind of knowledge and skill set to help them better understand their own data, so they don't have to put 15,000 units of data, of raw data online and say, go figure it out, right? That's what my analogy about the rubble, the scooping up the rocks and throwing them on the side and counting them. I feel like that they're really indebted to that mode of data analysis. But yeah, that's really, 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 really cool. The police department should hire you. You could give them some lessons. You can teach them how to read data, right?
I mean, if they're not willing to even like look at this process data, I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's that political unwillingness, right?
Yeah.
What are you thinking, Tara, about the visualization of data and the degree of difficulty that it is to actually get the data and do something more with it, even though they keep saying, well, there's not enough data there? So is it true that there's not enough data there?
No, I think there's plenty of data. And again, since we also have the qualitative piece that the city has not been willing to really make an effort to unpack and understand. We're a university town, so there are plenty of folks that are getting training in qualitative research methods, and there are plenty of professionals in town that have expertise in qualitative research methods that could do a thorough coding and do secondary coding and do a really rigorous analysis of those listening tours, and include the other reports, right? We have all of those other reports that are listed in that PowerPoint slide deck that you shared that have not been triangulated and put together. There is a cohesive story. We don't need to go talk to people more. Right. And the urge seems to be that in order for us to, well, actually, nothing ever ends up happening after they do these listening sessions. So the idea is that if we bring members of our Black community together so that they can perform their trauma for us publicly, then that counts as change. Because they take the information, but then there are always, people have plenty of good suggestions and they're in there, but then nothing is actually ever done.
So yes,
with that information.
I don't think you know this, but I got a letter from the city manager saying that they have these 3 people that they've selected, and they're going to go around and talk to these groups to get to hear what their values are on policing. And so I'm going to backtrack a little bit and just say that in 2014, the council approved a document called the Mayor's Task Force on Community Violence, which laid out very clearly what the community's, Black community in particular's, values were around policing and what they wanted.
And it's very clear, yeah.
And one of them was community policing. They want anti-racist police. I mean, even though it says they want them bias training, what they're saying is we don't want to have racist police officers. And they also wanted a considerable amount of effort made to deal with the needs of young people and also violent crime and repeat offenders. I mean, it's not a rocket science document, right? So in 2015, Race Matters Friends gets involved. We didn't know about this document, and we found out later that it existed, and they had no plans of doing anything. The only thing they did was the ban the box item, which was the easiest thing to do, which they probably have no way of measuring its effectiveness.
Right.
And there was also a report that was all the police departments in the United States had to respond to the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which laid out 7 pillars. Is it seven, Tara?
Yeah,
seven pillars of good policing, right? And how, in what ways was the department, implementing these pillars? So it was divided up among certain officers in the department. And the first pillar is about building trust and the guardian mindset. And the Columbia Police Department's response is like, well, we have things in our policy that suggests that we could do the guardian mindset, but we're not real sure that we're doing that. And that was like 2017. And I think that we're still in that same place. I don't think that or 2018, I'm not sure that we've moved one step beyond that. I think there's a lot of rhetorical conversation. Race Matters Friends did a policy brief. We also did this listening tour in 2017 when we were pushing to get this community policing plan. And then Sergeant Robert Fox wrote a report, which really it's supposed to be a report on implementing community policing, but instead it was an opinion piece on why community policing would not work. But within that document are pages and pages of public input, again, on top of what we saw in 2014, of people giving input on their values. So I recount all these to say that there is indeed a significant amount of qualitative data from stakeholders about what they want. And now they're going to restart this again with some new folks. And we didn't ask them to get them. We don't know where they came from. The person who they have on their team, Crystal Kroner, is with Cradle to Queer Alliance, Carolyn Sullivan with New Chapter Coaching, I believe, and Kyler Brodus, a trans man. I don't know why they picked these people. They're all nice people, but it's a game of kicking the can, very similar to what you're seeing, Yousuf, in the way that they use data to prevent us from ever really having a conversation about race, or prevent us from really having a conversation about anti-racism based on all the data that we have already.
Yeah.
So, I mean, part of having this discussion is that, we're still in the same place that we were in 2015. We've asked for community policing. They say we need more money. The police department, police chief has $25 million, and Health and Human Services has $2 million, right? So this is an equity conversation by nature. If our elected officials were anti-racist focused, they would also be outcome focused. And that is really, to me, the rub that we have, is that there's not a commitment to outcomes. They're very good at what I would call tap dancing and performances, right? So I really appreciate both of you, talking about the data. I'm going to let each of you sort of kind of give some closing comments and thinking forward, keeping in mind that they're going to restart this listening tour or getting focus groups or whatever you want to call it again. And how might we think about proceeding forward in terms of activist interventions? That's a big question.
I am really frustrated that we're going to do this again, because the information that they got in 2017 was the same information that people provided in 2014 on the mayor's task force, right? The story doesn't change because their practices and policies and behavior hasn't changed.
And it happened before under Darwin Hyman, by the way, too, right? There's a guy named Middleton in St. Louis that did a report about, mayor, three cities, needing to do, increase their trust with police, et cetera. And his conclusion was that the mayor lacked the political will to do it, right? Yeah. I think we have the same thing right now.
Yeah. And that's what it does take. It takes the political will of someone to say, you know what, let's make sense of all this information we have, and then take it back, right? And then take it back to the community and do what in qualitative research we would call a member check. Like, okay, we waded through all of this stuff, we organized it this way, and these are our conclusions. Did we get it right? Did we interpret what you told us correctly? Because fundamentally, I think what underlies this cycle of repeated focus groups, town halls is denial, right? It's a and a deflection that we don't believe what people have repeatedly told us. We don't believe people when black people when they tell us they have been harmed by our policing practices, even though the vehicle stop data is not complex. It's fractions, and you can run it through different statistical methods. You can do all kinds of things, but the disparity doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
So and the stories haven't changed, right?
Right.
You know,
And
they may be stopping a different cohort of people now because people are older, but
right.
the stories haven't changed. The experiences haven't changed.
Right.
And so I think it's, I think that it is a weaponizing of whiteness, right? The white people and the people that are working for the white power structure in town are going to come and ask you once again to tell us how much you think we have hurt you, not that we have. There's even not an admission, right? That has occurred. So it's really frustrating to me, I think, in terms of activism going forward, and I'm still really in the beginning stages of thinking about this. I guess volunteers are going to have to come in and unpack all of that stuff that we have, all the information we have, and do that work ourselves and make that as publicly available as we can. That's where I'm at right now. I'm sure there are other things too, but since I'm a data person, that's where I immediately go, is to let's go back to the data we already have. Yes.
Yeah, I was visiting our data, all the work that we've done so far to date. And it's an incredible amount of work that we've done in analysis and letter writing and all that. And it's very frustrating to know that they literally haven't taken the time to process the data that they've collected. Just remember when they did their last listening tour, they put it all online and the pages weren't numbered and there wasn't a table of contents.
Yeah, they created an index.
And Tara actually, created an index for us. That's pretty much almost all done, but still, it's pretty insulting. Yousuf, what are you thinking?
I think the biggest thing is kind of like Tara said, is the denial factor. Like you can see it blatantly in Milio's paper, like, oh, it's not racial profiling, it's not racial bias. And yeah, sure, it may not all be racial bias. Yes, it just goes to prove that there are systemic systems that are hurting Black people, whether it's like redlining or over-policing of certain neighborhoods and just like generational wealth, stuff like that. It just goes to show that there's even more work to be done.
Yes.
And he even acknowledges racial bias is a reality in America. So yes, we do need to do training with cops, and we do need to make sure that they're anti-racist. So I think the biggest thing here is like, we don't need any more data. We know there's a disparity, and we know there are several causes of the disparity, and they all need to be addressed through, especially like redistributing the funding of the police department, who gets way too much money and spends it on toys like riot cars that cost like $250,000. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we do have the data to show that there are problems that need to be solved. We don't have to point to just one singular problem, because there's just no way to do that. But we can solve the problems and see how much they affect the disparity.
Right. I think one of the biggest challenges is getting our media to chunk this information down in a way that informs the electorate. Unfortunately, not everybody gets their newspaper and gets their information from the local newspapers. Our city does a horrible job of doing outreach. And of course, they have a certain propaganda megaphone that they use to maintain their power structure. But I will say the most significant thing that you just mentioned, Yousuf, is when Jeffrey Milio says, racism is a reality. What he's saying is that racism is normal and that there's nothing we can do about it.
He literally says it's the norm in America.
Right. And so we don't have to accept that. And I think that they use that report in the Vehicle Stop Committee because that's the underlying premise, right? You don't say it out loud, but by using that paper, you're saying that we're never going to deal with race or disparities because it's normal. And of course, we have to use a paper that hasn't been peer reviewed because, you know, we couldn't get somebody who was legitimate, you know what I'm saying, to do that publicly. And so it's very interesting the way that these power dynamics work.
Well, and I was on that committee until I had to step out for some health reasons. And there was no willingness to read any other literature. It came up multiple times at the beginning when we were kind of figuring out how we were going to, you know, take a bite of the apple, so to speak. And nobody wanted to actually look at what folks that study this and have studied it for decades have to say. And so that's very teeny.
That's just bizarre. That's like saying, I want to be on this committee and let's all have a happy party of learning to do nothing. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And that we have an R1 institution in our backyard and that we would proceed that way. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thank both of you for being with us. Yousuf, I hope that you will continue to keep teaching us and showing us how to deal with this data. We have a similar problem with Columbia Public Schools in terms of discipline disparities and things like that. And we really run into the exact same problem of denial and doing performative things that don't allow us to really get at the root of the problem or get at the weeds, as I like to say. So I think my thing is, you know, how do we come up with interventions where we actually reach down and pull out the weeds rather than just clipping them at the top, you know? And I think it takes a lot of work to do that. It's not an easy process. So on weeds, stay tuned. We're not going anywhere, right? We're still here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you guys very much. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you. Thanks.
Problem.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.